Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 48th Annual Symposium of the American Indian. My name is Ashley Carter, and I'm a master's student here at Northeastern State. So this session is titled The Four Pillars of Identification, Redefining Indigenous People by Traditional Standards with Mark Boland, who is Cherokee. As you probably know, this session is one of many that are included in this year's virtual agenda. Please do take time to visit our website at nsuok.edu/symposium for more details regarding the agenda. All sessions will be recorded and made available in the coming weeks.
Osio Nagad, Mark Boland, Dawadon, Yoneg, Ale, Yonwaya, Dawado, Chalagi, G Chalagi, Ale, G, Ani Gaduagi, Ale, Tota Digega, Ale, G, Aniwaya. Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Boland. I'm from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, also a descendant of Katua. United Katua band members, and from Tulsa. I'm a member of the Wolf Clan, and what I'm going to be talking to you about today is my thesis work, what I've compiled for my master's degree here at NSU. All my master's work for my American Studies degree. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. I've got a little presentation. I'm going to sorry, I got to start by saying I'm not a PowerPoint professional, and I'm not a Zoom meeting professional. So I keep getting these dings in my ear about people wanting to be admitted into the room. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, I hope. See if we can do this. And I'm going to run through this presentation, and hopefully I'll have some time at the end to go ahead and take some questions if you guys got some questions lined up. But I'll go ahead and start sharing. I hope everybody can see this. And this is what I titled my presentation, The Four Pillars of Identification, Redefining Indigenous People by Traditional Standards. And the person you see on the screen, hopefully everybody in Oklahoma recognizes, that's Will Rogers. And we're gonna talk about Will Rogers, we're gonna talk about some other people, but as my thesis or my dissertation advisor, Dr. Douglas Miller, like he always says, we're going to go on a journey, and I'm going to reconnect it all at the end. And I hope you guys stick with me. And if you got any questions, save them for the end. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have, or any discussion that you're looking forward to. And just so you know, you might have to adjust the volume on your computers. I hope this is sharing. We might have to pause this a second.
Mark, there's no sound.
No sound.
He's gonna have to stop screen share.
Yeah, hold on.
Start it again, but before you click on screen share, down in the lower left-hand corner, they'll say a box that says share sound. Click on that.
Oh, okay. I got you. Share computer sound?
Yes.
Okay. We'll try this all again.
I'm a human being.
Are we still not getting sound?
See, when they got off the boat, they didn't recognize us.
Still no sound?
They said, "Who are you?" And we said, "We're the people. We're the human beings." And they said, "Oh, Indians." 'cause
I
they
hear
didn't
sound.
recognize what it meant to be a
Okay.
human being.
Thank you.
I'm a human being. This is the name of my tribe. This is the name of my people. But I'm a human being. But then the predatory mentality shows up and starts calling us Indians and committing genocide against us as a vehicle of erasing the memory of being a human being. So they used war textbooks, history books, and when film came along, they used film. You go in our own communities, how many of us are fighting to protect our identity of being an Indian? And 600 years ago, that word Indian, that sound was never made. On this hemisphere, that sound, that noise was never ever made. Ever. We're trying to protect that as an identity, see? So it affects all of us. It's reached a point, evolutionarily speaking, we're starting to not recognize ourselves as human beings. We're too busy trying to protect the idea of a Native American or an Indian. But we're not Indians and we're not Native Americans. We're older than both concepts. We're the people, we're the human beings.
Thank you for making me a human being. Makes my heart sad. A world without human beings has no center to it.
All right. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about what the concept that I developed in my thesis and through my studies is this idea of indigenous and indigenous descendant identities, and knowing the difference between the two and defining the difference between the two. I consider myself an indigenous descendant in that I do not belong to a traditional indigenous community. I am not fluent in my indigenous language, and also that I'm not an active participant in my indigenous culture. And I was also raised without the values of a traditional Cherokee. Even though I identify myself as Cherokee, I identify myself as an indigenous descendant. And I think it's real important. This is the problem that I've seen in research. This is the problem that I've seen in historical studies. I'm a PhD student at OSU, and a lot of the books I've read throughout my entire career, undergraduate and graduate, involve this problem of identifying indigenous descendants as indigenous people. And what the whole point of my thesis, the whole point of my studies thus far has been identifying the difference between indigenous and indigenous descendant. And I think it's very important that we differentiate the two, because that will propel studies further. We'll be able to better define ourselves. We'll be able to better define indigenous people, and understanding how we got to where we are and where we're going in studies and in the future. And this is the quote that I started my thesis with. This was actually a quote from a woman named Ruth Hopkins, who's a Lakota journalist. At some point, you have to decide if you're native or a native descendant. Are you part of a living culture? Is it merely in your ancestry? And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking, what we're really talking about is this is a pretty new concept, critical race theory. Critical race theory is the idea that race is a social construct. And I very much agree that race is a social construct. And race as a social construct has been explored by various scholars, and it's been explored. Dr. Cornel West, Race Matters, that's one of the books that I used as a cornerstone for my thesis. But he explores he explores the idea of critical race theory in his book Race Matters, but he explores it in the realm of African American studies, and it's also been done for Asian American studies. It's also been done for Latino studies, but nobody has really applied this critical race theory to Indigenous studies in the United States and Canada. And we have to kind of make a differentiation between Indigenous studies in the United States and Canada versus the United States in Latin America. Mexico, Central America, South America, they're kind of further ahead than the United States as far as this idea of critical race theory, what it means to be Indigenous. They've really explored this in Latin America, and what I would like to see is this explored a lot more in the United States and Canada. So I believe the dominant culture has blurred the lines between Indigenous and Indigenous descendant, because every Indigenous descendant who has the appearances of biological descendancy from Native people stands as an indictment of the Europeans and their descendants' participation in the ethnic cleansing of Indigenous people. Put simply, Richard Henry Pratt, who was in charge of Carlisle Indian School, he said, "Kill the Indian and save the man." Now we have the human beings, we have the men, but we don't have the Indigenous identification that we once had, and that stands as a testament to government policies. And so that's why I think that this critical race theory hasn't really been explored in the United States as much as it has in Latin America. But it's important.
You think of supremacy, you know what that is. It's a belief that you're better than somebody. But what I want to ask about is the other word. I want to ask about white. And what I want to specifically ask is, where do you think white people come from? Seems like an easy question. So anybody want to take a shot? Where are white people from?
Europe.
Okay. Get some countries in particular?
England.
Okay. Where else?
Tennessee.
Okay. Where else?
Yeah, America.
Okay.
Well, we're not from America, but
Canada.
we reside here.
Okay. Okay. So Europe's a pretty typical answer, right?
Right.
We come from England, Scotland, Ireland, Russia, Germany, France, right? What if I were to tell you that there were no white people who came from any of those places? I don't mean to criticize your answers. They were good answers, and they're probably the answers that most people would give if I asked that question. But actually, there were no white people that came from any of those places. When they came from England, what do you think they called themselves?
British.
The English, or British, right? When they came from France, what did they call themselves?
French.
Right. When they came from Russia, what were they?
Russians.
Right, right. They didn't call themselves white. So at what point did these people who had never, ever really thought of themselves as one big happy family, in fact, they've been killing each other for years, when did they decide that they were that?
That's a little snip of a clip. That's actually a recently released video by one of my favorite bands, Rage Against the Machine. They did a documentary and they talk about this idea of where whiteness came from, the idea of whiteness in America. And you saw in that clip, what they're doing in that clip is actually critical race theory. They're exploring the ideas of race. They're exploring the ideas of identity and what constitutes whiteness. And like I said, these areas have been explored, as far as European Americans go, as far as Latinos go, as far as Asian Americans go, as far as African Americans go. But really, people are not talking about this yet in terms of Indigenous studies. And that's what I would like to see. And so I built my thesis on the idea that four things create all people. And this can be, I applied this specifically to Cherokee people in my thesis, but these ideas can be applied universally throughout not just Native American country, but I believe throughout the world. When you share a community, when you share culture, when you share language, and you share values, I believe that creates your identity. And I always use the example of a French person. If a French person moves to America, and let's say they move to New York City. A French man moves to New York City. He marries, he has a wife and kids. Now, essentially, that man is French. You know, he comes from France. He's known to his home community. He's of the French culture, and he has French values, even though he's living in America. And so his kids, they have a little bit of that sense of community. They still have a little bit of that sense of culture, and they still probably speak French, but they're mostly going to speak English because they're living in New York City. And their community has changed. And so their values have started to change. And so the whole idea is every generation loses a little bit of that identity, of that French identity. Now, at any time, any of those descendants, his kids, his grandkids, his great grandkids, they can move back to France and they can attain this French identity again. And we really haven't explored that in the realm of Indigenous studies. We always harken back to what the federal government has instituted as our identification by government standards here in America. And those are quote unquote racial standards. You know, that's why we have blood quantums. That's why we have the CDIB. That's why we have the BIA. That's why we have all these government programs to regulate who is and who is not Indigenous. But what I say is they're regulating it by the wrong standards, and we're not really practicing sovereignty and autonomy by adhering to those government standards. We're actually practicing Western civilization, the United States impact on tribal governments, and we're actually we're reinventing the wheel, as it were. But I'm going to show you how community, culture, language, and values, how they're all interconnected. Because when I defended my thesis in front of Dr. Ian Anderson, who was the head of American Studies at NSU at the time, he asked me if I was an essentialist, meaning that you have to have every component in order to formulate identity. And I told him, yes, I'm an essentialist. I believe that you have to have all these together because they help formulate an Indigenous identity. And I'm going to talk about this guy right here. This guy, he's the one that started this whole investigation. And for those of you who don't know, those of you who probably don't major in Oklahoma history, this is Robert Latham Owen. Robert Latham Owen, he's an interesting guy. He was one of the first two senators from the state of Oklahoma. He actually ran for president in 1920. I believe he lost to William Jennings Bryan, if I'm correct, but I might be wrong on that. But he eventually lost the Democratic seat for president, and his great grandmother was a Cherokee princess. And we're going to talk about this whole mythology behind Cherokee identification. But this guy, he was really interesting to me because this is a man who was of Cherokee blood. He was a member of the Cherokee Nation, and he spoke the language. He actually printed a newspaper up in, he had several newspapers, and one was up in Veneta, and he had what they called the Indian Chieftain. And that was the Indigenous newspaper at the time, printed in both Cherokee and in English. And so he was very well educated as well. He had a master's degree from William and Lee University, I believe, was the name of the university. But he had a master's degree and he practiced law. He was a really, really smart guy. And he just really interested me when I read an article for my undergraduate. It was a newspaper article, and it involved this man too. And for those of you who are not Native American specialists, this is Charles C. Curtis. Charles C. Curtis, he was a senator from Kansas at the same time that Robert Owen was a senator from Oklahoma. And the article I read actually involved a debate between these two on the Senate floor. And for those of you who don't know, Charles Curtis was the vice president of the United States from 1929 to 1933 under Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover ran on the same ticket as Curtis, and Curtis was actually the highest ranking Native American in the history of the United States government. He was the first person of color to serve as vice president. Contrary to what some of the news reports said about Kamala Harris, he was actually the first person of color to serve as vice president and the highest ranking cabinet member for Native Americans. And he was an enrolled member of the Kaw Nation of Oklahoma. His mother was actually Potawatomi and Osage as well. And for those of you who don't know, Charles Curtis, if you've ever heard of the Curtis Act applied the Dawes Act, which separated tribal land and broke up tribal governments. The Curtis Act applied that to the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma. So he was the author of the Curtis Act. He was the author of this bill that broke up tribal land and broke up tribal governments. And he was an enrolled member of the Kaw Nation of Oklahoma. And I can't say for sure, but he could have enrolled Osage and he could have enrolled Potawatomi, but he chose to enroll Kaw. And some say that a big reason that he enrolled in the Kaw Nation, Charles Curtis was an interesting guy because he went 40 years without identifying as Native American. And it was only when land allotments came around through the Dawes Act that he and his sister ended up enrolling in the Kaw Nation, because the Kaw Nation got 180 acres as opposed to other tribes that got 80. So he got more land in Oklahoma, even though he hadn't been there since he was a child. He was born in Oklahoma, but at a couple months old, he was actually moved to Kansas City and raised in a foster home. So anyways, this debate that happened between Robert Owen and Charles Curtis on the Senate floor, this launched my whole investigation, because I saw a newspaper article that had these two pictures and they were dressed up in Sioux headdresses, in the typical war bonnet. And so it really struck me, I had never heard of either one of these guys, and I was just a junior or senior at the time. And I had never heard of either one of these guys. And I had especially never heard of them in the aspect of indigeneity. I'd never heard of, what they were about, who they were as indigenous people. And so I wanted to investigate more, and I wanted to know more about these guys and what they were arguing about. And they were basically arguing about whether Native Americans in 1906 should have been able to sell their land, or 1908, excuse me. But in 1908, they're having this debate on the Senate floor about whether Native Americans should be entitled to sell their land allotments, because there was still a 25-year stipulation that Native Americans who were declared incompetent couldn't sell their land. And so Robert Owen was making the argument that everybody should be able to sell their land. And we'll talk about some more about him and why he was making that argument here in a little bit. So who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Where are we at presently? And why does any of it matter? And why does this idea of indigenous identity matter to us, but also to political leaders, to scholars, all these different people? And so we're going to get into the aspects of all these things that make this indigenous identity and why it's important. And the first aspect is community.
And our mother Wanda, and of course Becky and Janelle, and we are the Gertie Family Singers. We grew up with our grandparents being right here on our dad's side. So Grandma and Duda's house was right there. My grandma and Duda were stomp dance people at the very beginning. They went to stomp grounds. They went to the ceremonial grounds. And Duda was a leader. He would sing. And that's where I think a lot of the singing that Duda sang came from that. So whenever they started going to church, that's when Duda used to would lead songs.
And he had the spirit. He had, he would sing them songs, and it would just be, he could fill that whole church building with his voice.
Whoever we are comes from them teaching us how to be, teaching us how to sing, and teaching us how to be Cherokee.
Hey, Miles.
They call this Gertie Hill because there's so many of us that live here. My grandpa's sister lives here. My grandpa actually lives up the hill here. And then his brother lives on the other side of the hill. And my grandpa's dad used to live up here on the hill. His house is gone now. And so I would come down here and spend all summer with my grandparents. So I was down here with my cousins and we'd be running around in the woods.
Do that snowball now.
All right. And just like they're doing now, this is what we would do. These songs that we pass down from each generation and the things that we do, the things that we show them, you know, it's just like being a part of this big chain, and each one of us is a link, and we're just passing this down, and hopefully each link is just as strong as the one before it. And maybe one of these days I'm hoping that my own grandchildren will come out here and play, you know, and my son maybe we'll sing the songs like we were singing inside, and they'll ask him, you know, they'll say, how do you know these songs, Edo? You know, who taught them to you? And he'll tell them, your grandma.
I just wanted to show that because to me that is what I would consider a traditional Cherokee community. You know, they still practice the language, and you can see their aspects of community are very tight knit. And to me, that creates what I would consider an indigenous identity versus an indigenous descendant identity, which is an indigenous descendant identity involves this whole idea of relocation. Place matters when it comes to identity because your identity is tied closely to your community. And if you have no ties to a traditional indigenous community, then it's hard to maintain an indigenous identity because you're not around people that speak the language. You're not around people that have those common values of a community. And so all these ideas are interrelated and interdependent. And this graphic here was created, the one on the left, which is a GIF that was created by an LSU student a couple of years ago. It shows the decimation of land from the 19th century into the 20th century, and how quickly that these tribal lands were lost. And the map on the right actually shows you concentrations of Native Americans today. And the darker the blue, the higher the concentrations of Native Americans. And as you can see, we don't have many of these tribal communities left. And so that's a big part of losing this indigenous identity versus gaining this indigenous descendant community identity. And a large part of it is based on this idea of community. You know, and it's important to look at where we were historically. You know, in 1715, a population of 11,210 people in these Cherokee villages before removal. You know, the first map is what they considered Cherokee territory, you know, all the way from South Carolina all the way into Illinois. You know, it was a vast expanse. And so you had these Cherokee tribal towns, and each one of these tribal towns maintained an identity that was distinctly indigenous. And so they practiced their traditional culture, they practiced their traditional religion, and all these communities, they were tight knit and they had the same language, same values and everything. So this indigenous identity back then wasn't a controversial thing. It wasn't an area of discussion. You just were. You know, and this shows Eastern Oklahoma for Cherokee people today and what they still consider indigenous communities, Cherokee communities. And these tribal towns that got shifted over to Oklahoma, oftentimes the entire tribal town would relocate in a particular area. We've seen that through past studies of linguists and past studies of anthropologists. You know, they showed that basically when people came over, whether it was on the Trail of Tears or the old settlers that resettled before the Trail of Tears, they often came as entire tribal towns. And so you get a lot of these distinct characteristics of the tribal towns here in Oklahoma, and you still find that here today. There's still, talking to one of my friends who's a linguist for the Cherokee Nation, a language teacher, Wade Blevins, he often refers to the fact that there are still, in Cherokee speech, there are still certain dialects that are distinct between communities, you know, how you pronounce words and certain phrases that are distinct between Cherokee communities. And so these are distinct characteristics of an indigenous identity. And Cherokees weren't the only ones that this happened to. And it's interesting to follow United States history and indigenous history, especially because you see when Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, when the 5 civilized tribes, when they got removed to Oklahoma, they were all grouped together as one big tribe, even though there were distinct differences in dialects and in maybe in tribal dress and all these different areas of culture. And they got removed to Oklahoma as one people, whereas people of the plains were often removed in little snippets. And I take the case of the Degaga people, the Degiha people, Degiha, excuse me, tripping over my words today, but the Degiha people are people of a similar language. And they say this is the Degiha Suyan language family. And we're talking about Poncas, Omahas, Kaws, Osage, Oto, all these different people who have very similar language. Actually, I don't know if Oto's in there, but Ponca, Omaha, Quapaw, Osage. There's all these people. They're different tribes now here in Oklahoma, but at one time, and they'll even tell you this through their tribal history, they were one people. It was just where they settled along the Missouri and Arkansas rivers. And when the United States began to relocate these people, they began to relocate them separately, even though at one time, if they were in the Southeast United States, they probably would have got relocated to one reservation and been given a distinct tribal identity, even though they were separate people. And that's what's really happened to a lot of Creek people, a lot of Cherokee people, is they lost their distinctiveness as, you know, maybe they were from, you know, any one of the tribal towns, but they were distinct from other tribal towns. You know, my family, we come from a little community called Black Gum, you know, and Black Gum is, you know, the way they speak, the way they act, the way they do things is different than, say, somebody from Jay. And so even though there's those distinct differences within the tribe, you know, this really calls into question the whole group mentality of tribalism and indigeneity through community, you know, and that's why I say community is so vitally important to an indigenous identity. And, you know, I've talked a lot about how language is an important part of tribal identity, because language is the means of communication for a community.
They beat me every day. They beat me. They cut off my hair, made me kneel in front of the door where everybody come in. Everybody make fun of me when they come by me, rub my head and laugh at me because I was talking. They caught me talking. I hope someday somebody will hear me. I hope nobody has to go through this. We have to have our own language. Because what we do when we talk to our spirits, they don't understand English. They look at you, you'll be talking English. What are you saying? Tanse tueng. Tanse magay tueng. Nobody's saying that in Cree. Like, no, you didn't know what I just said. That was a hard time in my life. I'll always remember it. For that white man, it's a terrible shame for him to be treating people like this. Because we are a people. We just need to be accepted.
Kind of breaks my heart every time I see Andrew Wendy Boy talking about his Cree language and the loss of language, and that's something that we have to recognize, especially in that video, he's talking about his boarding school experience and his loss of his Cree language. And he actually says, he lost his Cree language in boarding school, but was able to attain it once he returned home to his parents and to his reservation, to his community. And so that's why, I talk about language being so vital to the identity of Indigenous, and if you don't have that language component by which the community communicates, then you don't have an Indigenous identity. And this is from the Cherokee Nation website. And this is talking about how the Cherokee Nation is committed to language preservation and all the things that they do. They talk about how hard the language is to acquire. They talk about the written form of the language. They're talking about all these steps they've taken to preserve the language. But really, what is the thing that is missing that I've seen from my own studies is the essentiality of tribal languages in everyday life, and that's why I showed the Gertie family there, and their use of the tribal language within their community makes sense. But when you get out into the larger society, we've seen recently, that in the past 30, 40 years, especially as Spanish has come from south of the border, you've seen this English only kind of movement. And really that's very damaging to tribal languages and the idea of tribal identity, because we're kind of losing that as we lose our languages. And I always make the case, and I was really disappointed in 2015 when the Navajo Nation changed their stipulation that the tribal president had to be fluent in the Navajo language in order to run for office. And so I was disappointed, because that kind of changes the aspect of the essentiality of language. I wish our own tribal our council meetings and everything else, I wish tribal business was done in the tribal language. That would create an essentiality for tribal languages again, but we don't have that, because really tribal governments are a reflection of the federal government and the American system as a whole. And so, our languages are constantly under attack. Even to this day, that in little subtle ways. I remember this from 2019, and I kind of got in trouble for talking about this at the Oklahoma Council for Indian Education Conference, but it's an important thing to talk about, because we have to talk about these aspects. And I remember when I was a kid growing up, my freshman and sophomore years, I went to Ponca City High School. And, you know, I grew up around Poncas and Otos, and they use this word "but" a lot. And, you know, and at Frontier, which is located in Red Rock, you know, which is, you know, mostly Oto tribal members going to that school, 60%. One of the teachers wrote on the board that "but" is not allowed in the classroom. It's not to be spoken in the classroom, because she said it wasn't a real word, you know. And so one of my friends who actually works in the linguistics department for the Oto Missouri tribe, he wrote this on his Facebook, and he talked about the aspect that not only is "but" a word, but it's a man's word. And you know, there's a difference in our tribal languages. Some, especially in the plains, they have what they call the way a female speaks and the way a man speaks. So these tribal languages have their own idiosyncrasies that make them distinct. And for Oto people, you know, this word "but" is actually a derivative of a man's word. And so I remember as a kid growing up, you know, the boys always said "but," the women never said it. And it's been interesting over the last 20 years to see how that's changed, because you see a lot more women saying "but," and men didn't say "a." You know, that's another common phrase amongst Native American people here in Oklahoma. Men didn't say that, you know, growing up. Boys didn't say that, but it's like the generation right below me, they started to develop these interchangeable. Men started using women's words, and women started using men's words. And so it's been interesting to follow those aspects of language. And it's, you know, these kinds of things are important. You know, they're important for identity. They're important for who we are as Indigenous people. And this is a quote I used in my thesis. This was coming from Circe Sturm's book, Becoming Indian. And it's the struggle over Cherokee identity in the 21st century. And I argued some of the findings that she found in her work, but Robert Thompson, an Eastern Band Cherokee man in his early 40s, explained it to me in this way. We get so many people calling for genealogy. They want to do this. And I tell them, I say, you can spend 10 years trying to track down your ancestry to prove that you're a Cherokee. Now, why don't you do this? Why don't you spend that 10 years and learn to be a good Cherokee? Why don't you learn the language? Why don't you learn the history? Why don't you learn the culture? Why don't you really become Cherokee? You know, and I think that's an important point, you know, because, you know, so many people are looking to these government standards, these federal government standards, which are not our own community standards of identifying ourselves. And, you know, this is a perfect example. You know, this man was named Iron Eyes Cody. His real name was Oscar de Corti. Oscar de Corti was a Sicilian. His parents were Sicilian originally from Sicily, but he was born in Louisiana. But he became this famous Indian actor when in actuality, he had never been around Native American people. He was simply depicted as Native American because his skin complexion, because he had some of the features that were considered Native American. So he looked the part, but he was not actually Native American. And so, you know, getting down to culture is a reflection of language. It's also a reflection of community. You know, it's a reflection of the community values that we talk about. And culture is hard to define. You know, this is the Cherokee Nation website's definition of culture. Cherokee culture encompasses our long-standing traditions of language, spirituality, food, storytelling, and many forms of art. And what they're talking about is, you know, all the aspects that go into culture, but what they're really talking about and what they don't mention in this is culture. Cherokee culture is a reflection of Cherokee communities. You can't find Cherokee culture outside of Cherokee communities. And that's why I say culture is, and all these ideas are interrelated and very important to each other, but important to the Indigenous identity itself. You know, and I bring up this map here to show you, you know, Cherokees aren't the only ones. The Creek people were the same way. Creek people, you know, when they were relocated to Oklahoma, this is their original homelands in Georgia and Alabama, into Mississippi even. You know, they had their own tribal towns. And I was talking to one of my brothers, you know, his name's Pete Kozer, and he was telling me, you know, at one time, each one of these tribal towns, whether it be Fish Pond or Bika, you know, all these different tribal towns, they had their own tribal identities. They had their own distinct identities from one another. They shared a language in common, but just like Cherokees, they could communicate with each other, but their dialects were different. You know, even their ways of dressing, certain cultural aspects were different from town to town, and they were all distinct. But they weren't distinct enough to the European invaders to differentiate them as a tribe, you know, where the Dagiha people were different enough by the time that they encountered the United States that they ended up getting their own tribes, whereas Creek people, Cherokee people, they were all thrown into the same tribe and shipped out west. You know, and so you have all these different people coming in from all these different places. You know, sometimes they're thrown together as confederations, like Cherokee people, even the Wichita and affiliated tribes out west. You know, the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Those are two distinct tribes, but they're thrown onto the same reservation. At one time, Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache people were thrown onto the same reservations. They were lucky enough to still maintain distinct tribal identities, whereas, you know, Cherokees and Creeks and all these other people ended up, you know, with these similar identities. I don't know what happened there. But that was just a little demonstration of the different ways that there are these different, you know, different aspects of culture, you know, and it's a reflection of your community. You saw some smoke dancers, you saw some stomp dancers. All of these are indigenous, but they're all distinct to their communities, and they're all distinct cultures among themselves. And so we're talking about, you know, we're talking about all these things. And the last thing that really stuck out to me, and this one took me the longest to kind of incorporate into my thesis.
Oh,
Grandpa, speak English, please. Listen, I need to understand what's happening to me.
Oh, you gotta get out of here. I belong here. Why aren't you at your table like old man says? What is the big deal about that place? Can't I get a straight answer around here? It's a power deal. Bastelk found out, so they killed him. Well, they're gonna kill you if you stay here now. Come on, let's go. Well, sometimes they have to kill us. They have to kill us. Because they can't break our spirit.
Look, I don't have to do this.
You don't have any choice.
I'm trying to help you people. Now, why won't you accept that?
It's in our DNA. You have to do what old man says.
What makes you such a threat?
We choose the right to be who we are. We know the difference between the reality of freedom and the illusion of freedom. There's a way to live with Earth and a way not to live with Earth. We choose the way of Earth. It's about power, Ray.
Go get him up, Jimmy. Get him up!
What we've got going on here. some reason, I'm not being able to click out of this. Hold on, let's see if we can start that again. All right, there we go. We're back up. I hope I'm back up. But what we're talking about here, hold on now. I lost you guys. Try this one more time. Told you I'm not a PowerPoint nor a Zoom expert.
Mark, we have about 2 minutes and we'll have to hop over to our keynote presentation.
Okay. I'll just wrap it up real quick. And that last aspect that I was talking about, it was just values, you know, and in that clip, I think that clip best shows the values that Indigenous people have, but specifically that tribal communities have, which is different from the dominant society. And that's what that whole movie is about. If you've ever seen Thunderheart, it's one of my favorite movies, but he returns to this Indigenous society and reattains this Indigenous identity, which is distinct among tribal people. So I'll just end it with that and say thank you to the students and the administrators there at NSU for having me and letting me kind of trip through this presentation. And I hope everybody, I hope it was meaningful to each and every one of you. And I hope that it generates further discussion. That's what my overall goal is to generate further discussion through these kinds of things.
Well, thank you, Mark, for your presentation. Could you please give us your contact information in the chat? And thank you all to everyone who joined us today virtually and to Mark. Also, we ask that you take a moment to follow the link in the chat. That will take you to the session evaluation, and we would love to hear your feedback that we use to continuously improve the symposium each year. So thank you.